Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Okay, so last class we start introducing the array. So we know to declare array where we will have the data type, and then we have the array name, and we also need to give a capacity, right? So pretty much to tell the array how much or how many data we will store in it. So with this, right? So if we declare array with whatever capacity we have, it will provide us with the element or entries with index from 0 to capacity -1. So if we have an array of size 5, then we will have the element or the entries from the, let's say we have A5, then we will have the entry from A0 to A4. Okay, and those variables in the array can be processed at once with a for loop, right? So whenever you want to go through the array, you can use the for loop to access the data. And whenever we do a task involving the array, we should code it with its own loop. And we can visualize the array as a line of variables. So arrays look like a line of different variables, and you can store data in it. Okay, and we can also initialize the array. So last class we did, we initialized the array, and then we store the data from the user input. Now we can initialize it when we code, when we declare the array, right? So just put the data in the bracket, and then in the bracket you will have the data. Now your data will read in the order as you list the element. So the first data will be stored in the index 0 and the index 1, and then the last data will store in the your array of capacity -1. And now let's question.
For the equals and then the curly brackets with the data, does it have to be all in one line when you declare and assign the array, or can you do equals to the curly brackets with the data anywhere?
Okay, you can, when you code it, you can separate the line because the C++ doesn't read the line. So
Okay.
even you have the special actual line between them, or you put them in the different line and put a comma, it's fine.
Thank you.
Do we need a semicolon at the very end? Yes. So when you declare it at the very end here, right? So if you declare array and then initialize it, and you will end it with the semicolon. So semicolon is where it will tell C++ you end the line. Okay, now let's look at the example 1. So it will ask you to read an exam score for 5 students. And it will ask you to calculate their average, which we did last class. And we want to find the maximum scored and print the average and the student who with the highest scored. Okay, so let's say we have 5 students in like a very small class. And this 5 students And I store those students' name in array. So I have array that stores the 5 students' name. So we have the first student name Alex, the second student name Freddie, the third student name Jack, and then we have a student name Haley, and then the last student name Max. Okay, so I store their name in array. Now we will ask them what's their scores, maybe on exam. And we will also store them in array. So you can imagine you will ask what's the score for Alex, and let's say Alex get 30, then we will put the score that corresponds to Alex's name. And the second student is Freddie, and we will ask what Freddie get. And let's say Freddie get 70. And we will ask what grade does Jack get. And let's say Jack get 50. And we'll ask what's the score Kaylee get. And let's say Kaylee get 40. And you ask what's the score Max get. And let's say Max get a score of 100. And then the program will calculate the average. It will tell you the average is whatever the number, and then you will say Max received the highest score. So if you look at our question, how many loops do we need to have for this question? Three. Right, so if you look at it, what are these three? So here is your first task that need a loop. Right, you need to read in the score. Right, because you need to ask what score does each student get, and you will go through the loop. And to calculate the average, you need to add up their score. So you need to go through the array. So here is your first array task. Then here's your second array task. And then to find people who received the maximum score, you need to go through the array again. Now to find people with after we did that, after we find the maximum score, we want to print the average and the student with the highest score. Now, is this an array task? No, right? You can just print the result. right? So we find the average from the second task, and we find the student from the third task. So this is not an array task. So we don't need to do it. We can just print the result out. Okay, so with this, we can start working on the code. So if you look at the data, what data do we need to have? We need to have two arrays, right? One store the name and one store the score. Now, how do we initialize or declare an array that will store their name? What would the data type be?
String.
It will be string. So we will declare a string array and just call it names. And we need to store file name. And then we can just list their name, where we will initialize it since this class is always this file student. Right, so this is how we can declare it. And then we need to declare an array for scored. Okay, I see people say why string, because we are storing the name, right? So the name is the string data. You put it in the quotation. So depends on what data you're storing, you will initialize your array with that data type. Okay, and for the scored, our score will be an integer value, so we will store it with the integer type. So we have an int scored to store their grades, and we need a capacity of 5. Now, for now, we won't initialize it since we will get the score from the user. Now, people say, why not double? Well, you could declare as double, but here we assume their score is always integer value. If you want to declare as double, there's nothing wrong to it. It depends on the question. So here we assume their score is integer. And now what else do we need? What other data value we need? Well, we know to calculate the maximum score, we need to calculate the total value. And we also need to calculate the average. And average need to be double. So we will declare a double for the averaged. And for the total, we will initialize it to 0. Right, so we did that last class. Now our first task, now with all the data we need, the first task is to read in their score. Read in scores. Now to read in their scores, this is an array task. We will have a for loop, right, going from 0, index 0 to 4. So will be I strictly less than 5. So that will go through index 0 to 4. And then I plus plus. Now, every time we go into the loop, we will ask, right, you will make a prompt and ask them to enter the score for, and then we can print out the name. and then we can store it in the score I, right? So we will store it in the corresponding position. So this we will read in the score. Any questions here? Now the second task is to calculate the averaged. Again, we will go through the for loop, and it will go from 0 up to 4. So it's the same for loop. And we need to add up the score to get the total. So since there's only one task, I'll just do total add equals the score. So we'll add each score to total. And then the averaged will equals to total over 5.0. Right, and we explained that why do we need to divide 5.0? We need to make it a double type. A total is an integer, so we need to make the number we divide a double. An integer divided by a double will give you a double result. Any questions here? Okay, then the third task, well, we need to find student with math scored. Now, how do we find the student with math scored? Remember we did like similar question with to find the maximum value. How do we do that?
You make a max variable, and then like you have a for loop that checks if like the like an element in the array is bigger than the max, and if it is, you change the max value to that array value.
So we start with any element, and normally we will start with the first one. So we will assume this is the max, right? And then we compare it with each element in your array. Now, if your new entry is bigger than your current max, then you will update your max. Now, the only thing you need to be aware is you want to find the student with the maximum score. So you not just want to find the maximum score, you want to know who get the maximum score. So what do we need to keep track? The index, right? So we will start with the first index, which is 0. So we check, is this the max? If not, we will update it until we find the max. And wherever the max you find is the index, then you can find the corresponding student. So it's similar idea, but now we will keep track with the index. So since we will keep track with the index, we will initialize max I. So I use max I as the index, and we will initialize to 0, right? So we will assume the first person have the maximum score. And then we will go through the array to check who actually get the maximum score. Now we can start with a 0. Then when you check the first one with Excel, nothing really happens and they equal to each other. Now, if you want to start with 1 here, it's also fine. You don't want to check 0 with Excel. So if you want to start with 1, save a case, that's also fine. Okay, so here is your loop. Now in your loop, you need to check. Now what we check here? when do we update the maximum I? Why are you comparing? I see people say when I is greater than max. What is I and what's the max? Like, what are we comparing here? What should I put in this if statement here?
When scores of I is greater than max.
What's max?
Max would be 0.
So you are comparing your number with 0?
Well, you're comparing your number to the current value of max I.
Yeah, so you also need to put the max I into the score. Right, since you are comparing the score. Right, so the max
I don't think that's correct. You're checking scores of max I. It's gonna check scores of it's gonna check scores of 0. It's
max I still give you the index.
oh you wanted to have the index?
You need to use the index to find the student who got the maximum score. Right, that's what we said before. If you look at the question, we want to find student with the highest score.
Right.
So you not just want to find the 100, you also want to find who got the 100.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right, so if you just find out the 100, then without the index, you will not know who get the 100.
Oh, so you're just saving the index of the highest score.
Yeah, so that's why we need to store the index of the highest score. Then you have access to both what's the maximum score and also the person who got the maximum score.
Oh, okay. Okay, I misunderstood the problem. Sorry.
Okay, so that's why this I here, we start with the 0 since we want to start with the first person. Like we assume the first person got the maximum grade, and then we will update it as we comparing with the rest of the array. So if we have this, then we will update the max I to the current index. So now your max I will be the person with the maximum score. Now finally, you want to print the averaged and student with math score. Then you will just see out the averaged is and then you can have the averaged print out, and you can also print out the student with the maximum score is, and then you can have the student's name, and then we end the line. So that will be our code. Any questions here? Yes, we will need to print the name with the maximum index. Let me fix that. Okay, so if you look at here, I already put the code in, right? So for this question, right, so we initialized the 5 students' name, and we want to read in their score, right? So we need to declare the array score, and since total, we need to calculate total for the average, and total is also integer type, so you can declare at once. So you can actually declare array and the variable at once, as long as they belong to the same data type. Now we also need declare a double value for the averaged. Now to read in the score, we have a for loop. We ask them to enter the score for each student, and we will store the data, and then we will go through the array the second time to calculate the total and to divide by 5 to get the average. And we find the student with the maximum score, so we store the average. And then to print the result, we have the average print out and also student with the maximum score. Okay, so if you run it, it will ask us to enter the score for Alex. So let's say we put 30, and the score for Freddie, let's say 70, and the score for Jack, let's say 50, and the score for Kaylee, let's say 40, and the score for Max is 100. And we'll run that. It will give us the average is 58, and the student with the maximum score is Max. Any questions here? Okay, if not, we will move on. So today we will look at the 2D array. So the array we did last class, and the example we have earlier is the 1D array, where we see we store the data in a line, right? So we see data that look like this. Now 2D array, you can think of it as you store array in a table. So that's why you have like a 2-dimensional data. Right, so this is what we call the 2D array. Now to declare a 2D array, you still have the data type and the array name. Now instead of you have one box for the capacity, now you have 2, right? So 1 for number of rows you have and 1 for number of the column you have. Now if you want to initialize it, you will initialize each row. Right, so to initialize the 1D array, right, in the bracket you will have each data. Now you will have first row of your data, comma by second row of your data, and so on. And to process the 2D array, instead of a for loop, since now you have row and then the column, then you will go through the element with the nested for loop. Right, so you will have one layer of the for loop to control the row and one for the column, which means you can either do an outer loop for row and inner loop do the column, or you can have the inner loop do the column and outer loop do the row. Now, which one do you choose? It depends on the question. You will see whichever one does the job for you. So when you want to go through the data in a 2D array, you need to ask yourself, doesn't matter you go through the row first or the column first as your inner and outer loop. Okay, so let's look at the next example. So let's say you have a data that look like the following. You have a 3, a 6, a 4, 1, 5, a 9, a 2, a 6, a 5, a 3, a 5, 8, 9, 7, and 8.
Professor,
Yes.
a 2D array, is it, what's the maximum number of rows and columns? As many as you want?
As I think it's the size of the size of the integer. I think it depends on what data you store. So there is a capacity for it, but for the question we did in this class, you won't see the capacity.
Okay.
Okay. Now for this data here, to initialize it, we have an integer array. And let's say this array with the array name data. And this array with 3 rows. So you will have the first box have 3, and then the second box will be number of elements you will have in each row. So you have 5 columns. And then to initialize it, you will initialize each row. Right, so you will start with the first row, which is row number 0. So you have 3, 6, 4, 1, 5. And then the second row with 9, 2, 6, 5, a 3, and a 5, 8, 9, 7, 8. And once we finished, we will have the semicolon. So if you want to put them in separate line, it's fine. You can still compile it. Just at the end, after you declare it, you have the semicolon till that you finish declaring it. Any questions here? Now let's say the first question will be which row gives largest sum? And then the second question will be which column gives largest sum? So the first question, you want to add up each row and ask which row give you the largest sum. And then the second question will be, you will add up the column and ask which column give you the largest sum. So if you look at this question, how do you want to go through the data for the first question? If you want to find the row give you the largest sum. Okay, I see people say nested loop. Well, we have a 2D array, right? For any 2D array, if you want to go through each element in the array, you need to have nested loop. Now, since we have 2D array, we have two layers. So we have an outer loop and an inner loop. So what should we start? So we do outer loop for row, inner loop for column, or let's see. Okay, here this should be outer loop for column, inner loop for row. Okay, so people say outer loop for row, and then inner row will be for the column. Because we want to add up the number in each row. Now to add up the number in each row, you need to add all the number in the column. Now for the second question, since you want to go through each column, then you need to add the number in each row corresponds to the column. So for the second question, you will do an outer loop on column and an inner loop for rows. Okay, so here I already have the data listed here. So if you look at it, it should be the same. We have 36415, 92653, and 58978. Okay, and we want to find, so first for the for question 1, we want to find the row give you the largest sum. That means we need to store the index for row. So we need to find the maximum row number. So we will start with 0. And we will also need to store the maximum sum. and we will also initialize it to 0. Okay, then we will go through. So we have the outer loop for the row. So we have int r start with 0, and r need to be less than 3. R plus plus. Now we need to have a sum that will add up, that will add the sum for the current row. Right, so we initialize to 0, and then have the inner loop that will add up the sum. So the inner loop will take care of the column. So we have sum plus equals to the data of R and C. So the first entry is always corresponds to the row. The second will be for the second one will be for the column. Right. So once you add up the sum for that row, you will compare it with the maximum sum. So if your current max is greater than the max, your current sum is greater than the max sum, then we need to update the index. Then you will have max row equals to the current row number. And you also need to update the maximum value. Right, so now your maximum sum will equal to sum. Any questions here?
Yes, my question is when after the header you have int data brackets 3, 5. What is that?
That's to initialize our 2D array.
Oh, okay, I see.
We have a 2D array here. Okay, any question on the code here? So after the nested for loop here, we will have the maximum, the row give the maximum sum stored in the max row. So we can see out the we can say max row. So that will give you index of the max row followed by give the max or give the largest sum. Okay, so that will be the first question. Now for the second question, it's pretty much the same thing. Now the difference, let me just copy the code. The only difference is now, instead of looking at row, we are looking at the column. So we have maximum column sum. Then the outer loop will be for column. And then we also need to have a sum keep track of sum of each column. And then the inner row, inner for loop, we will add up the row entry of that column. And then we will add the entry to the sum, and then we will compare it to the maximum column sum. Now, if the current sum is larger, then we need to update the maximum column sum, and then we need to also update the index. Any questions here? So the difference between these two is the order you do the inner and outer loop are different. Okay, so let me save the code here. There's one place I forgot to change. And then the second one will give you. Okay, so here it will give you the second row. Okay, so by here it means the second row, it should be the third row. Since the index here, we start at 0. So if you want, you can do the row plus 1. Right, so the row number 2 will be 0, 1, 2. So that will be here. The second 0, 1, 2 will be the last row here. So if we quickly calculate it, the first row give you a sum of 19. We have 2 plus 6 is 9, plus 4 is 3, plus 1, 14, and then 19. The second row give you 11, 17, 22, 25. And then the last row give you 13, 22, 29, and 37. And then if you look at it, right, the row number, the last row, and it will be indexed 2. And then if you look at the column, the first column give you a sum of 17, and then here 16, and you have 19, and here you have 13, and here you have 16. So the maximum will be here. Any questions? You have to change row. Let me check. Yes, here I also need to change the maximum row to the column. But it happen to be they are the same here. Now let's add 1 to it since our index start with 1. Right, so it will be third row and then the third column, 1, 0. So here will be first, second, third row, and first, second, third column. Any questions here? Okay, if not, we will end it here and I will see everyone next class.
Thank you, Professor.